capacity, the adaptive capacity, the conservation of these northern and southern populations is really, really important. So in this talk, what I'm going to go through is the advancement over time, over the decades, and you guys are part of this, very much part of this story. Over the recent decades, the advancement in management and monitoring, and then what that tells us, what that has enabled us to say about the current range-wide status of the species, and furthermore, what the recovery potential is for the species. And again, my takeaway is that that this really is a story based on collaborative action, data-driven action in conservation, and that some of the lessons learned in the American horseshoe crab conservation story applies to the Asian species. The IUCN had developed this kind of framework for conservation called the Reverse the Red. And if you look back as we look back at how limulus conservation evolved, it very much followed this framework. And the framework has four elements to it. One is mobilizing networks to increase the capacity for assessment and conservation planning, conservation action, empowering communities, diverse communities, to get involved in this so that you have support, broad support. You're not dividing people, you're bringing people together to achieve this kind of durable conservation. And you're measuring, you're developing the capacity to measure the results of the conservation. So you're bringing the data to bear to measure progress and prioritize action and know what works and what doesn't work. And then importantly, and really kind of what motivated us to write this paper and give these kind of talks, is to amplify success, show that it's not all rosy. I don't want you to get the impression I'm just, giving a rosy picture, because it's mixed in terms of success, but there has been some significant success that are worth amplifying. If you look back over these decades, you can break it up into these chunks of time. In the pre-1995, the really focus was just on biological, not ecological research, focused on LAL. Unsustainable bait harvest was occurring, and there were signs of ecological decline. The focus was a lot on Delaware Bay, but really applied range-wide. As we moved into the late 90s, early 2000s, advocacy raised awareness significantly, and there was a reluctant but significant management response, and horseshoe crab focused NGOs and programs started to emerge. Between 2000 and 2010, there was significant growth in robust monitoring programs. And there was really a great capacity within agencies, as Derek was explaining the kind of how his program got started. And there were efficiencies that started to be built into the bait use, which decreased harvest demand. Local sanctuaries were established, and coast-wide assessments were initiated. But the data really wasn't quite there yet. But the parts were put into place so the data could be there as we continued in time. So 2010s, there was significant capacity within state agencies. Derek's program is a really great example, but there's others along the coast to increase the capacity for assessment monitoring. Adaptive management was started in Delaware Bay, and the IUCN specialist group was started and completed a red list assessment for limulus, focusing on extinction risk. As we moved then into the 2020s, which is not a complete decade yet, but IUCN, which is kind of has been my focus a bit, continued and assessed recovery potential. There was a team I'll talk about later and their work. Monitoring assessment became institutionalized. So, and Katie will talk about ASMFC's work in more detail, but that's illustrative of that. And more recently, synthetic LAL was approved by the authorities. So one example, one signal for the increase in capacity is if you look at the scientific literature and how that's changed over time, you see that before 2020, the focus of the research was really on biological rather than ecological studies. And a lot of that was driven by the LAL development. And then in 2000, as awareness of this overharvest and ecological decline rose, then there was that released funding and support and demand prioritization for ecological studies. And so you saw a significant growth in that. And although the 2020s is a partial decade, we're really on pace to exceed previous decades in the production of research on ecological topics, which feeds then into building capacity for monitoring assessment. In addition, citizen science has played a significant role for this species because unlike many marine species, almost all marine species, this critter crawls up on the beach and lets us count them, which is a pretty nice thing because it feeds not only into data, which can be used in assessment, but it also raises awareness. So it's a great way of connecting people to the resource because we conserve the things we care about. And so these like spawning surveys that you guys started in Massachusetts, started planning in 2007, started implementing in 2008 is a great example of that. But they really were occurring up and down the coast. Project Limulus in Delaware Bay started in 1997 with like a tagging and also a spawning survey element to that. And there's examples throughout the bay. One kind of lesson we learned when we look back through all this is that the places where we don't currently have the capacity for assessment are the places where we don't have the monitoring. And then those are the places we don't have the connection between kind of the conservation community and the state agencies. So that's a critical connection that has to be made. And so I'll hit on that again later as we move through the talk. But for a robust assessment, we have to have, I mean, the citizen science is great, but sometimes it's hard to get citizens to go out when maybe the horseshoe crabs aren't there in great numbers. They like to go out when they're in great numbers. They're less inclined to go out when they're not in great numbers. But statistically and scientifically, we have to have, and to support a robust assessment, we need to have a more a kind of statistically valid approach to collecting data, which includes sampling at all possible times and places. And so we want to distribute our survey effort to when and where horseshoe crabs can be encountered. And depending on the season, that might be offshore or nearshore, onshore. And we want a long time series to detect changes because ecological data is pretty noisy. So over time, we've developed, there's a lot of surveys that are out there, fishery independent surveys that encounter horseshoe crabs. And they need to be assessed for the degree to which their information provides sufficient signal for the noise. So we want a good amount of encounters so that we could see what's happening even though there's a lot of noise and uncertainty in it. And these are just the main ones that we've looked at through mainly ASMSC's work and the ones that have kind of risen to the top and entered into the coastwide assessments. But there are many. We have a significant amount of data to look and for the species. Also, there are many examples of communities who have gotten involved with horseshoe crab conservation. A good example from my neck of the woods are these teacher workshops called Green Eggs and Sand workshops, which are focused on middle school and high school teachers and building there's a curriculum on horseshoe crabs that can be included into their curriculum that discusses the kind of ecological interrelationships all the way up, and the science behind LAL and evolution, all the way up into how management decisions are made and how decision feeds into those kind of management decisions. But the community sanctuaries where they have no harvest beaches have been growing in Delaware Bay and elsewhere. Shorebird advocacy has played a very important role in raising awareness and pressuring decision makers to reduce harvest. And the watermen deserve a nod in that they voluntarily, in many cases they're mandatory now, but initially they voluntarily started to use bait saving devices of their own design to conserve and reduce the demand for bait. There's also in Delaware Bay, there's a couple of programs where citizens go out and they flip over stranded crabs, but those they all have important role in kind of raising awareness and building concern and care for the species. Ultimately, though, I'm interested in the scientific aspect of this, and the important thing is to measure the impact of conservation. We're doing good things. What is the impact? Are we achieving the objectives of recovery that we set out for? And there are two entities that engage in that at a large scale. The ASMSC, Atlantic States Marine Fishery Commission, does coastwide assessments on like a 2 to 4 year cycle. And they coordinate a team of scientists at state and federal agencies and academia. And they focused on limulus. There's significant separate focus on Delaware Bay because of the significance of that as a shorebird stopover. Also, the IUCN looks not just at the Atlantic coast, but also in the Gulf of Mexico, where the horseshoe crab has populations in Florida, on the western coast of Florida and Alabama, and I guess into Mississippi. And then there's a discontinuity to the Yucatan. But IUCN is range wide. ASMSC is just Atlantic coast wide. And they've conducted the red list and green list. The difference there is the red list focuses on extinction. Green status focuses on recovery potential. In response to the decline in the 90s, bait harvest was decreased due to regulation, but again, partially due to this voluntary and mandatory use of bait saving devices. And the mandatory, I was there during these discussions, and the mandatory reduction was something like 25%, but the actual reduction was something like 50%. This initially, like in that 1997, 98, 99 period. And the difference was this bait saving device. So I just like to shout that out because it really is a collaborative response here. Coastwide biomedical collection. So bait harvest has been reduced under different regulatory decisions over time. At the same time, coastwide biomedical use has increased. Now, LAL harvest is not fully, not all of those crabs die. There's a lot of data on that, and it really does come down to about 15% mortality. I think there's certain instances, and it depends on how the crabs are handled and all that, and there's lots of studies. Chris Chabot has great work with Wynn on that. But looking at a lot of studies, it does turn out about 15% mortality. That it still is dwarfed. That mortality is still dwarfed by bait harvest. So although you could talk about, LAL harvest as a driver, it's really the mortality, fishing mortality is really bait mortality, and it depends on the location and all that. it really actually depends. It matters a great deal where this harvest occurs, because the harvest impact depends on how many crabs are there. So if you're withdrawing money from a bank, how much money you can withdraw and not draw that account down depends on how much you have in that account to begin with. And just the same way, how much harvest you can have and sustain it depends on how many crabs are there in the first place. And so looking just at Delaware Bay, the mature female harvest dropped significantly in 2004 and again in 2008, and again really in 2012, 2013, due to regulation. And there's a moratorium on female harvest in Delaware Bay. There's some harvest of Delaware Bay origin that occurs in Maryland and Virginia, and that's why it doesn't exactly go to zero here. But there's continued LAL harvest, but it's here I'm showing LAL harvest in, I don't know if you can see these colors in green. That's coastwide, because the harvest numbers are confidential. We can't show them specifically for a location because of the rule of three. Derek can explain that on the side on break or something. But anyways, it matters a great deal where this harvest is occurring. So that continuing, as we're measuring the impact of these regulatory changes, we look at the response in the abundance. And so in Delaware Bay, here we're showing the female harvest. And so we're seeing the response. Now there's a lag because it takes a while for a horseshoe crab to mature. But we have seen, this is one measure of significant success, we have seen significant increase in the horseshoe crab population in Delaware Bay. Most recently, the estimates are like 16 million adult females and 40 million adult males. Over the past 10 years, you could see that the average in the previous 10 years of this time series is much lower than the average in the most recent 10 years. The Delaware Bay region harvest rate for males is less than 0.5%. That's most of the harvest comes from males in Delaware Bay. And it's less than 0.1% for females. And that's in comparison to what we think of natural mortality of like 10%. So it really is not a significant harvest mortality in that population that's allowing growth. And there are actually two lines here. One includes all of the coastwide LAL harvest and one does not. And they're completely overlapping, which just shows you that the LA harvest in Delaware Bay is really not a significant driver. So the ecological impact of high abundance, I mean, it's great to see the population increase, but what we want to see for recovery is that the population is recovering to ecological functionality, so that these populations are playing the ecological role that we intend them to play. And so that shows up in trophic relationships with horseshoe crabs and how they structure the benthic communities. But here are some examples of that. When you have high densities of horseshoe crabs, they disturb each other's nests, and those eggs come to the surface and become available for predation. And so this is a couple beaches in Delaware Bay. The top couple pictures show these kind of swaths of eggs that are available for consuming, and they're numerous. And you can see how the swash deposits those eggs across the beach. And then there's also a significant transfer of energy as these crabs are naturally overturned and die. There's a significant transfer of energy from the marine environment to the nearshore and terrestrial environment through that process of natural mortality. And you can see that, those stranded crabs. And it's kind of akin to what you would see in the transfer of energy in salmon, in major salmon runs in the West. It's that level of transfer of energy. I mean, based on kind of our rough calculations, see if I could dig that up, but it's significant. I don't have the number here, but it's like there's like 1.6 million females and 4 millions are expected to die annually on the Delaware Bay shorelines each year. That's equivalent to 3,600 metric tons of biomass, based on our kind of rough calculations. So the other stock assessment is the ASMSC and the Atlantic coast, and the improved status has not really been limited to Delaware Bay. The most recent assessment, 2004, from ASMSC found the coastwide population to be in good condition. The reference point was the population returning to a level that was seen in the past. And Katie probably will go into this in much better detail, but the results are mixed. In the Southeast and Delaware Bay, the status was good. In the Northeast, the status was neutral, but that was an improvement from the past. New York is kind of a problem spot, and it continues to be rated as poor, and needs management change, intervention. IUCN developed the green status assessment to look at recovery. So we know, the red list looks at extinction risk, the green status looks at recovery potential, and recovery is defined as this ecological functionality. Is the population reaching the level to play the roles that we intend them to play, or what nature intends them to play, however you want to think about that. And that differs on depending on the population. And these assessments are spatially explicit. So in this map, you see different units that are defined, and each recovery potential is assessed within each of those spatial units. We found that this team found that horseshoe crab conservation relies on horseshoe crab harvest regulation, of course, but the real concern was about habitat and the widespread habitat loss that is expected to occur, has been occurring, is expected to continue to occur, that would then constrain increase of populations and therefore constrain ecological functionality. So therefore, it's imperative that these habitats be identified and they be conserved. And the big focus is on spawning and early life stages, because those are the stages that we think determines abundance in the long run. And this is what we mean by the habitat loss. On the left, we see some pictures of shoreline that have been hardened through riprap. And the top two on the left are roughly the same location, Port Mahon in Delaware. And you can see, I mean, it's always had some amount of armoring as long as I've known that beach. But you can see how far the beach has eroded by looking at the placement of the location of those telephone poles, because in the past the road was to the right of those telephone poles, and now the road is right in the middle. Those poles are right in the middle of the road, and that we used to be able to collect eggs on this in patches of beach on this sand for egg studies, and right now there's no spawning on any beach. And then there's also these kind of breaking up of the beaches by bulkheading. The photo below the Port Mahon photos is a beach in northern Jersey called Fortescue. And these are areas, these kind of enclaves are places where they spawn, and there are eggs there, but it's highly disturbed. And so the shorebirds don't use those areas efficiently. And then on the right are areas that are in a beach where Mark Botten and Bob Loveland did a lot of their seminal research on horseshoe crab reproductive ecology. And you can see different kinds of habitat loss. You see exposing of beach of peat outcropping, salt marsh intrusion, and you see overwash, and you see this hardening of and truncation of the beach foreshore. All this is not to say that horseshoe crabs only spawn on nice sandy beaches, and that if you lose the sandy beaches, you lose horseshoe crabs, because these are generalist species within the estuarine environment, and they can spawn successfully in a wide variety of shorelines. As you guys know, a picture here from Pleasant Bay, for example, but also down in Florida, and a picture here in the lower part here on, I assume you're seeing my mouse, but in Jersey, they spawn in these kind of marshy areas, and some really great research is being conducted, especially by folks from South Carolina. Mike Kendrick and Dan Sasson are leaders in that, and I know folks up there getting involved. Chris is involved, looking at them spawning in these what could be think of as marginal habitats, but maybe not so marginal. You know, they're maybe quite critical for sustaining this population, especially as sea level rise reduces, starts to move the shoreline further onshore. But we care about preserving kind of optimal spawning habitat, in the sense of optimal is maximizing survival and development of the eggs, and development and recruitment. We care about that because the conditions on these shorelines determines development, and then development determines how many crabs you're going to have in that population. I'll try to show you in the next couple of slides what I mean. So work by Penn and Brockman, seminal work in the 90s, and been reproduced elsewhere. But it's pretty clear that oxygen temperature determine maximum development of the eggs into first stage instars, and then survival of those to recruitment into juvenile age classes then determines how many animals you're going to have in that population, all else equal. So this is work by Sweek et al. Looking at a life history model, and there are three scenarios. The only difference between these three scenarios is egg development and survival levels. And those egg development survival levels are kind of equally spaced numerically, but you can see that the growth rates and the equilibrium abundance are not equally spaced. So there's this nonlinear relationship between egg survival and development, and then ultimately population growth rate, equilibrium abundance, and therefore ecological functionality. So that's why we care about this. Now, it's context specific. So whatever habitat in a particular estuary provides the highest egg development and survival and recruitment, that is the optimal habitat within that matrix of habitat. But we have to recognize that that is going to determine in a great degree, ultimately, population growth rate and equilibrium abundance and ecological functionality. So the green status assessment's conclusion were that limulus populations have moderately depleted from historical benchmark of like pre-anthropogenic effects. And we used 1850 as that benchmark, but that habitat loss and sea level rise will limit recovery potential. We're assuming harvest regulation will continue, that will continue, but really ultimately the recovery potential is going to be limited by habitat loss and sea level rise. And that limulus, although limulus as a generalist, it's been around for a long time, it's going to continue to be around. We don't expect to be extirpated in any of the spatial units, most likely. But in the worst case scenario, we can see that limulus would be extirpated from Florida, in the south of Florida, and some of the Mexican spatial units, the Yucatan areas because of the shoreline development and sea level rise. Some recent updates that I'll share. In the Yucatan, there have really been some great genetic studies that really support the evolutionary significance of the horseshoe crabs. And given that the management is really insufficient down there, and development is pending in many places down there. There's a pressure to develop a lot of that coastline. That we really should shine a bright light on that Mexican subpopulation, however you want to think about it. Losing that genetic diversity down there would be akin to losing all the horseshoe crabs in the Northeast. So I mean, that kind of they kind of bookend in terms of genetic diversity. So if you were to lose all the limulus in the Northeast, that would be like losing the Mexican population. So that's where we should focus. We tend to focus on the high abundance areas, and rightfully so, and but we don't want to lose sight of these edge of the range areas. The Alabama Mississippi area is really under capacity. We don't know enough about what's going on down there. Florida, there's statewide programs looking at populations and habitat, but the issue down there in some of the populations is harvest of juveniles for aquaria, and that's kind of under the radar and needs focus. In the Southeast, it looks like Southeast has been going well, but there has been some recent declines in some of the indices. There have been some significant beach closures and changes to LAL practice recently that were forced through lawsuit settlements. And there's this really great research on marsh spawning that's kind of emerged from that Southeast area. Up here, you guys know all about up here, but I will say that in the Delaware Bay, the adaptive management continues. I think it's been really successful and probably underappreciated. ASMSC is holding stakeholder workshops to continue to make sure to add the values of the stakeholders into that process. And high spawning densities have been reported in recent years. In the New York, which I indicated as kind of a problem spot, there's a harvest moratorium was passed by the state legislature, but vetoed by the governor. And the governor had cited some recent changes by the state agency to protect against overharvest. And I think it's better to include the state agencies in this collective effort. So I'd like to see the state agency respond and be work hard to improve things without being blocked out by a moratorium. That's my personal opinion. But no matter what you do with that harvest, if you lose the shoreline, you're screwed. So at the same time, there's this lot of public focus and advocacy on this harvest moratorium. In areas like the Peconic Bay, which is on Long Island, there's like a 200% increase in bulkheads. So these are not working together. As far as the Northeast and the Gulf of Maine and so on, that's the topic of this workshop. So I won't spend time on that. So the key elements of success have been elevate horseshoe crab conservation through education and public awareness, engage diverse stakeholder communities, including local communities, form partnerships and collaborations, find allies within management agencies to build up the capacity for monitoring and assessment and sustain it. Because this is a long-lived species, it takes a while to start to see the effect of the impact of conservation. The importance of partnership and collaborations is really apparent in the absence. So the places we don't have this kind of capacity are the places where we don't have those partnerships. But also, when it comes down to it, conservation is about, like, I focus on data and all that, but it's really about the facts that derive from data, and also the values we bring to this. And diverse stakeholder communities bring diverse perspectives and values. Local communities offer knowledge and they offer their values, and they need to be respected and acknowledged. But ultimately, a durable conservation depends on a shared value. It's built on shared values. Um, and at the start of the talk, I said kind of the takeaway, alluded to takeaway messages, that a commitment to collaboration is the key part of this, the key element of success. And I think as far as what we may bring to the Asian horseshoe crab conservation story, I think that's it, that they have the same kind of major threats, although there's some unique aspects in Asia. The challenges are the same. They have to develop these baseline. They have one big difference is they have this diverse political structure that complicates transboundary coordination. So ASMFC does a great job at coordinating the states. So you have these different political structures and management agencies within the states, and they all have different approaches and priorities. But ASMC brings them together and coordinates that across those boundaries. Imagine how that works in Asia, where it's not just like Massachusetts and Virginia, it's China and Japan and the Philippines and Indonesia. And so it's very complicated, and it's a huge challenge. But ultimately, it's built on, conservation is built on this collaboration of the public and the community, and collecting data and measuring impact. So I think I just want to shout out to many people, collaborators. Carl Schuster, who started some of his work there in Massachusetts, about the time he was completing his PhD when I was like being born. He almost made it to 100, but during his life, he inspired many of us to really spend time and study this very interesting species and everything that's connected to it. I want to say that the Limulus Green Status Assessment Team was, Wynn Watson was on that team, as well as Jane Brockman, Ruth Carmichael, Eric Hallerman, and Jaime's Oliver Ray. And updates were provided by folks up and down the coast, including Derek. So at this point, I will stop, and hopefully I haven't taken too much time, and open it up for questions. And I can't hear the room.
Off.
Yeah, we're working on it.
Testing.
Try?
Testing.
No. Hmm? Try. Try again?
Testing. Testing. I don't think it. Oh. Okay. All right. It's pretty sensitive. So.
Sorry.
Could you repeat the questions?
Yeah, when we do that, can you ask the question and I'll repeat it for this mic? We'll try that.
My question is, to Dave, does he think that the ASMFC is targeted?
I missed the last part of that question. I'm not hearing the room.
unmute you.
That's bizarre. Is it
All right, it's unmuted.
Dave, can you hear me now?
Did he
Yes,
go? He
thank
go.
you.
You can hear me?
And yeah, let me just say, I'll be here for the duration. So if you wanted to hold questions for later, because I know I took a little bit longer than I intended.
Okay, I think I'm going to answer that one because that's a governmental policy question. I don't know that anybody in the room has a clue what's going on with any of that. So any other questions for Dave? Yeah, again, can you?
Sure. He had mentioned the Yucatan Peninsula population was genetically different. I was just curious if there are any visible signs of that. Do they look different? Like how do you?
Okay, Dave, so I'm
Well-
repeating a question. Oh, do you hear it?
Yeah, I think I heard it as if they look different, they're genetically different, or they look different. Well, as you know, the horseshoe crab, if you pick one up, no matter where you find it, you'll recognize it as a horseshoe crab. But they tend to be smaller in some places. They're really tiny in Maine. They're much smaller in the Yucatan. They're smaller in Florida, for example. There's some taxonomic differences, morphologic differences in Georgia population. There is variation in the morphology, but they're easily recognized as a horseshoe crab. Yeah, that's probably about all I can say. I've never been to the Yucatan, so I can't really speak from first knowledge.
All right, great, thank you. Do we have any online questions?
Yes, we have one question online. Can you talk more about the approval of synthetic LAL in the US and its ability to replace LAL?
Dave, did you hear that?
Okay.
Or do I need to repeat?
Yeah, I think I get the gist of that. So having the US Pharmacopoeia endorse or authorize synthetic LAL was a pretty important step for LAL being more widely synthetic LAL being more widely adopted. However, there are still economics involved. It's cheaper to use LAL from the crab source. It's cheaper currently. So they have to get the cost of synthetic LAL down. This is my understanding. So I'm not deeply involved in that, but this is my understanding. They have to get the cost of that down to make that shift complete. But again, I want to emphasize it depends on the population, but LAL harvest is not the big driver of fishing mortality. So if you think fishing mortality is a problem in a population, the best lever to change to reduce that harvest is bait harvest. I know, I think there's various reasons why I think LAL gets more attention because there's more money there. But anyways, it's just, anyways, enough said.